You know, Kunle, when we were in school, all the boys used to like me and ignore Morayo completely. It used to make her so sad. I remember she cried once because nobody asked her to a dance.
I remember that too. I cried a lot back then. I've grown since.
The land alone is valued conservatively at several hundred million naira. She has declined every single offer.
What property? Morayo, what is he talking about?
She wore diamonds to her best friend's house just to make her cry. She had no idea the woman she came to mock owned half the street she was standing on. By the end of that afternoon, her own fiancé would look at her like a stranger. Stay with me till the end because this story has a twist you will not see coming. And if you love stories like this, hit that subscribe button now before we start because you do not want to miss what's coming next. Lagos is a city that never stops talking. Everybody is watching somebody. Everybody is comparing something. A new car, a new house, a new relationship. In this city, two women grew up sharing one small room, one small bed, and one big dream. Their names were Folake and Morayo. They were closer than sisters. They told each other everything. They cried on each other's shoulders when their fathers lost their jobs. They shared one pair of school sandals for 2 whole terms because there was no money for a second pair. Back then, nobody could have told them that 20 years later, one of them would stand in the other's parlor wearing diamonds, smiling with her mouth while her heart planned humiliation. Folake grew up to become the kind of woman men turn to look at twice on the road. Slim, tall, skin like polished mahogany. She learned early that beauty opened doors that hard work sometimes could not. She built a name for herself online, first with small photos, then with sponsored posts, then with a following so large that companies paid her just to smile into a camera holding their products. She had over 1 million people watching her every move. She had a wardrobe stuffed with clothes she wore only once. She had a car that cost more than most people's family homes. And in 3 weeks, she was going to marry Kunle Adeyemi, a businessman whose name alone made bank managers straighten their ties. Morayo's life took a different road. She was plus-sized in a country where women her size were mocked in markets, ignored at parties, and whispered about at family gatherings. Aunties called her the fat one, as if it was her only name. She never married. She never went viral. She never had a single photo that got more than 50 likes. What she had instead was a small catering business she built with her bare hands after burying both her parents within the same year. A modest 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet Lagos street, and a habit that nobody who knew her from a distance would ever suspect. She fed people, quietly, constantly, without cameras, without captions, without asking for anything back. The two women had not spoken properly in almost 4 years, not because of one big fight, but because of many small ones. Small comments, small jealousies, small silences that grew into a wall neither woman admitted was there. Folake believed deep down that she had won. She had the body, the face, the man, the money, the fame. Morayo, in her opinion, had nothing. And that was exactly the problem, because Folake needed Morayo to know it too. So, on a warm Saturday afternoon, 3 weeks before her wedding, Folake decided to pay her old friend a visit. She told Kunle it would be a sweet reunion. She told him Morayo was her closest childhood friend and that he simply had to meet her before the wedding. What she did not tell him was the real reason for the visit. She wanted him to see with his own eyes exactly what she had escaped from. She wanted him to look at Morayo's small apartment, her plain clothes, her tired eyes, and then look back at her own bride-to-be and feel grateful all over again for choosing beauty over everything else. She dressed like she was going to a red carpet, not a friend's living room. A wine-colored designer dress that hugged every curve she had paid a personal trainer to sculpt. Diamond earrings that caught the afternoon light every time she turned her head. A handbag that cost more than 3 months of Morayo's rent. She checked herself in the car mirror one last time before they arrived, and she smiled, not out of joy, but out of anticipation. She was ready for his show. She just did not know she was about to become part of one. Kunle noticed his fiancé's strange excitement the whole ride there. He assumed it was simply the joy of reconnecting with an old friend before starting a new chapter in her life. He had no idea that underneath that excitement sat something colder, something almost cruel. He was a careful man, the kind who paid attention to details in contracts and in people. But even careful men can be blind when they're in love with someone who has learned to perform sincerity so well that it looks exactly like the real thing. When they arrived at Morayo Street, Folake's smile faltered for just a second. The street was cleaner than she expected, lined with flowering plants in old paint buckets, children playing football with a half-flat ball, women greeting each other from doorstep to doorstep like one large family. It did not fit the picture she had built in her head, a picture of a friend who had been left behind by life. She pushed the thought away and knocked on the door with a knuckle heavy with rings. Morayo opened the door and her face lit up immediately. No performance, no hesitation, just pure joy at seeing a face from her past. She pulled Folake into a tight hug before Folake could even finish saying hello. And for one brief moment, something in Folake's chest tightened uncomfortably, something that felt dangerously close to shame. She buried it quickly. She was here for a reason. "Look at you," Morayo said, stepping back to admire her old friend, her eyes warm and completely without envy. Come in, both of you. I made food. I hope you are hungry." The apartment was small but spotless. Simple wooden furniture, faded but clean cushions, a wall lined with photographs that told the story of a life lived quietly. Kunle noticed immediately how different it felt from the curated, camera-ready perfection of Folake's apartment. This place felt lived in. It felt honest. They sat. Morayo served them jollof rice and grilled fish before they even finished settling into their seats, moving with the ease of someone used to caring for people without being asked. Kunle thanked her sincerely. Folake picked at her food and began, almost immediately, to steer the conversation exactly where she wanted it to go. "So, Morayo, how is business these days?" she asked, her voice syrupy sweet, the kind of sweetness that hides a blade. "Still doing the small catering thing from home? I keep telling people, my friend can cook, but without proper structure, without investment, it's hard to grow past a certain point." Morayo smiled, unbothered. "It's growing small. God has been faithful." That's good, Folake said, already moving on, already searching for the next opening. She turned to Kule with a laugh that sounded rehearsed. Back in school, Morayo and I used to share clothes. Can you imagine? Now, look at us. I always tell her she should try this diet I'm on, the one my nutritionist designed. It changed my whole body. I could send you the meal plan if you want to finally, do something about. She let the sentence trail off, gesturing vaguely, laughing lightly as if it was the most harmless joke in the world. Kunle shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He glanced at Morayo, expecting hurt, expecting her face to fall. Instead, Morayo simply laughed along, genuine and light. "I've heard about that diet, maybe one day. For now, this rice is calling my name," she said, spooning more food onto her own plate without a single trace of shame. Folake's smile tightened just slightly. The joke had not landed the way she wanted. She tried again, this time sharper. Kule, when we were in school, all the boys used to like me and ignore Morayo completely. It used to make her so sad. I remember she cried once because nobody asked her to a dance. She laughed again, waiting for Kunle to laugh too, waiting for Morayo's face to crumble under the weight of an old, private wound dragged out into the open. The room went quiet for a heartbeat too long. Kunle did not laugh. His jaw tightened, and for the first time since they arrived, he looked at his fiancée the way you look at someone you thought you knew completely, and suddenly do not. Morayo simply nodded, her voice soft and steady. I remember that too. I cried a lot back then. I've grown. Since, she stood up before the silence could stretch further. Let me bring more water. Please, eat. Don't let my rice go cold on my account. As she disappeared into the small kitchen, Folake leaned toward Kunle with a triumphant little smile, as if she had just won a private game only she was playing. See what I mean? She's still the same, sweet girl, but honestly, she's settled. No ambition, no drive. It's actually a bit sad when you think about it. Kunle said nothing. He was watching the kitchen doorway, where Morayo had just disappeared, and something in him had already begun to shift, though he could not yet name what it was. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't scroll past without hitting that subscribe button, because trust me, what happens in the next few minutes is going to completely change how you see both of these women, and you don't want to miss a single second of it. Outside, on the quiet street, a group of children ran past the window kicking their half-flat football, and one of them, a small girl no older than 7, suddenly stopped and pressed her face against the window, grinning widely. Auntie Morayo! Auntie Morayo! Come and see, I scored a goal today. Morayo, returning from the kitchen with a jug of water, laughed warmly and waved through the window. Well done, my dear. Tell your mommy I said congratulations. Folake rolled her eyes slightly, but Kunle's attention had been caught. He watched the exchange with quiet curiosity. A moment later, an elderly woman appeared at the doorway, leaning on a wooden walking stick, her eyes searching until they landed on Morayo. My daughter, the old woman said, her voice trembling with emotion. I just came from the hospital. They said my bill has been cleared. God bless you, my daughter. God will bless you and multiply you. The room fell silent. Morayo quickly ushered the old woman inside, offering her a seat, gently deflecting the praise. Mama, please, don't stress yourself. Sit down. Let me get you something to eat. Folake's smile had completely disappeared now, replaced by a flicker of confusion. What was that about? She asked, trying to keep her tone light, though something uneasy had crept into her voice. Nothing, Morayo said simply, waving it off. Mama Bisi has been struggling with her health. I just helped small. Kunle's eyes had narrowed slightly, the way they did when he was reading the fine print of a contract, searching for the detail everyone else had missed. He said nothing yet, but he was no longer simply a guest sitting politely through an uncomfortable reunion. He was watching, he was paying attention, and what he was beginning to see did not match a single word his fiancé had told him about this woman. A knock came at the door again, softer this time. A young man, perhaps 20 years old, stepped in hesitantly, holding a folder of documents against his chest like it contained his whole future, because in many ways, it did. Auntie, I'm sorry to disturb you at home, he said quickly, eyes darting nervously toward the stranger seated in the parlor. I just wanted to say thank you. I registered for my exams this morning. I start school again next month. Morayo's face broke into a wide, proud smile, the kind of smile that comes from somewhere deep and unguarded. That is wonderful news, Toby. I'm so happy for you. Your parents would be proud. The young man's eyes glistened and he nodded quickly, too overwhelmed to say much else before excusing himself and disappearing back down the street. Folake sat frozen, her wine glass halfway to her lips, forgotten completely. Morayo, she said slowly, her voice suddenly stripped of its earlier sweetness. What is going on? Why do all these people keep appearing at your door like this? Morayo shrugged, almost embarrassed by the question. It's nothing serious. Toby's parents passed away last year. He had to stop school because there was no money. I just helped him get back in. It's not a big deal. Not a big deal, Kunle finally spoke, his eyes quiet but firm, his eyes fixed intently on Morayo now. You paid for a hospital bill for a woman you're not related to, and you're paying school fees for a boy who lost his parents on top of running a business. How is any of this possible? Morayo hesitated, clearly uncomfortable being the center of attention for something she never intended anyone outside her small circle to know about. I don't do it for people to know. I do it because I remember what it felt like to have nothing and no one to help. My parents didn't leave me money, but they left me the habit of never letting someone go hungry if I can help it. That's all this is. Folake let out a short, sharp laugh that had no humor in it at all. Please don't sit there acting like a saint in front of my fiancé. Everyone knows you barely make ends meet with that small catering business. Where exactly is this money for hospital bills and school fees coming from, eh? Because last I checked, you are still struggling to pay your own rent 2 years ago. The words landed heavier than she intended, sharper than even she expected, and for the first time since they arrived, something flickered across Morayo's face. Not anger, something closer to quiet, tired sadness. I was struggling then, Morayo said softly. Things have changed since. Changed how? Folake pressed, leaning forward now, sensing something she could not yet name but desperately wanted to expose. What exactly changed, Morayo? Before Morayo could answer, there was another knock at the door, firmer this time, more formal. Morayo excused herself to answer it, visibly relieved for the interruption, though the relief would not last long. An elderly man in a crisp white agbada stood at the door, a leather folder tucked under his arm, and a driver waiting patiently by a black car parked at the curb. "Good afternoon," he said politely, his eyes scanning the small parlor behind her before settling back on her. "I apologize for coming unannounced. I tried calling, but your line was engaged. I have some documents that require your signature. It concerns the Ikorodu property." The room went completely silent. No words coming out. Kule sat up straighter in his chair, his earlier suspicions sharpening into something closer to certainty that he was missing an enormous piece of a puzzle. Everyone else in this room already understood except him and his fiancée. "Please, come in, sir," Morayo said quickly, her voice tight with something that looked almost like embarrassment, as if she had been caught in the middle of a secret she had worked very hard to keep. The old man stepped inside, nodding politely to Folake and Kunle before settling into the chair Morayo offered him. He opened his leather folder and began speaking in the calm, measured tone of a man who had spent decades handling matters far more delicate than this one. "As you know," he said, addressing Morayo directly, "since the passing of your late uncle, the property in Ikorodu has remained under dispute among the extended family. I am pleased to inform you that the courts have finally ruled in your favor. The land is officially yours, along with the 3 commercial buildings currently standing on it." Folake's glass slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a sharp crack, wine spreading dark across the tiled floor like a stain she could not take back. "What property?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper now, all the earlier sweetness completely gone, replaced with something raw and unguarded. "Morayo, what is he talking about?" Morayo sighed, running a hand over her face, clearly wishing this conversation could have happened anywhere but here, in front of anyone but these 2 people. "My uncle, my father's older brother, passed away almost 2 years ago. He never married, never had children. There was a long dispute over his properties among distant relatives, people who barely visited him while he was alive, but suddenly appeared the moment he died, all fighting over what he left behind. I never wanted any part of that fight. I only went to court because his lawyer insisted I had a legitimate claim as the closest living relative who actually took care of him in his final years." "How much is this property worth?" Folake asked, and even as the words left her mouth, she seemed to hate herself for asking, hate how naked her greed sounded hanging in the air of her friend's humble parlor. The old man, sensing the tension, but professionally unbothered by it, answered plainly. The land alone, given its location and the current development happening in that part of Ikorodu, is valued conservatively at several hundred million naira. With the buildings included, considerably more. Several investors have approached Miss Morayo directly, some through myself, some through other channels, all hoping to purchase it. She has declined every single offer. Declined? Falake's voice cracked on the word. Why would you decline that much money, Morayo? Do you know what I could do with even a fraction of that? Morayo looked at her old friend for a long moment before answering, her voice steady but quiet, carrying none of the bitterness that would have been so easy, so justified to let slip through. Because that land isn't meant to make me richer. I've spent enough of my life without security to know that money means nothing if it just sits in your account, making you comfortable while people around you are drowning. I'm going to build a community center there, skills training for young widows so they can support their families, a small business incubator for young entrepreneurs who have nothing but a good idea and no capital, a shelter and support program for street children. That's what that land is for. That's what my uncle would have wanted, and honestly, it's what I want too. Kunle sat completely still, absorbing every word, and something in his chest had gone tight and cold, the kind of coldness that comes not from anger, but from the slow, sinking realization that you have been standing next to a stranger this entire time, someone you thought you knew. I need to tell you something, he said suddenly, his voice quiet but carrying enough weight to pull every eye in the room toward him. Morayo, do you remember a charity food distribution event in Aja almost 3 years ago? A church group organized it, feeding families in one of the flood-affected areas. Morayo's eyes widened slightly with recognition. Yes, I remember. I volunteered there for almost 2 months. I was there, too, Kunle said slowly, memories clearly surfacing behind his eyes. I didn't know your name then. I just remember a woman who stayed behind every single day after everyone else had gone home, making sure the last child, the last old woman, the last person in that line got fed before she allowed herself to eat anything. I remember asking someone who she was, and they told me, that's just Morayo. She does this every week, rain or shine, she never misses. I never forgot that. I didn't know it was you sitting here today until just now. The silence in the room had shifted into something entirely different now, heavy and thick with things unsaid. Falake's hands were trembling in her lap. Kunle, she said quietly, almost pleading now, all the earlier confidence drained completely from her voice. Can we please just go home? But Kunle wasn't moving. He was still looking at Morayo, his expression unreadable, his mind clearly turning over every single moment of the visit, replaying every cruel joke his fiancé had made, every dismissive comment, every calculated insult disguised as playful teasing, and measuring it all against the quiet, steady grace of the woman sitting across from him. I have one more question, he said finally, his voice careful now, deliberate. Morayo, do you never tell Folake about any of this? The inheritance, the charity work, all of it. You two grew up together. She's supposed to be your closest friend. Morayo was quiet for a long moment before she answered, and when she did, her voice carried no anger, only a tired, honest sadness that seemed to be sitting inside her for years, waiting patiently for someone to finally ask the right question. Because somewhere along the line, Folake stopped seeing me as her friend and started seeing me as her measuring stick. Every time something good happened in my life, I watched her get uncomfortable, like my happiness was somehow taking something away from hers. So I stopped sharing. It was easier to let her believe I had nothing than to watch her shrink every time I had something good. I know that probably wasn't fair to either of us, but it was easier. Folake opened her mouth to argue, to defend herself, but no words came. because somewhere deep inside, in the part of her she rarely allowed herself to visit, she knew every single word Morayo had just spoken was true. The old man cleared his throat gently, breaking the heavy silence. "I'll leave the documents here for your review, Miss Morayo. There's no rush. Please call my office whenever you're ready to proceed." He stood, gathered his folder, offered a polite nod to the room, and let himself out, leaving behind a silence so thick it felt almost physical. Kunle stood up slowly, straightening his jacket, his eyes never quite meeting Folake's. He said, "I think we should go." Quietly. It wasn't a suggestion. Folake rose on unsteady legs. She turned to Morayo, searching for something to say, some way to undo the last hour, but the words that came out were small and hollow. "I'm sorry about the food. It was really good." Morayo simply nodded, walking them to the door with the same quiet grace she had carried through every humiliation that afternoon. "Travel safe," she said softly, and closed the door behind them without another word. If this story has already got you hooked, please subscribe now before we continue, because everything you thought you understood about these two women is about to be turned completely upside down, and the next part of this story is where things get really interesting. The car ride home was silent, not the comfortable silence of two people who understand each other without words, but the heavy, suffocating silence of two people suddenly realizing they might be strangers. Folake stared out the window, watching Lagos blur past in shades of orange evening light, replaying every single word she had said inside that small parlor, feeling each one land now like a stone in her stomach. Kunle drove without speaking for almost 20 minutes before he finally broke the silence. His voice measured, careful, the voice of a man choosing his words with the precision of someone diffusing something dangerous. "Why did you treat her like that?" Falake's first instinct was to deflect, to laugh it off, to say it was just harmless teasing between old friends who understood each other. But something about the events of the afternoon had cracked something open in her, and instead what came out was smaller, more honest than she intended. "I don't know." "You do know," Kunle said quietly. "I watched you plan every single comment. You wanted her to feel small in front of me. Why?" Folake stayed silent for a long moment, watching her own reflection in the passenger window, barely recognizing the woman staring back at her. "Because I was scared," she finally admitted, her voice cracking slightly. "I was scared that if you saw her, really saw her, the way people used to look at her back in school before they knew her, and then really got to know her, you'd realize she was worth more than me. She was always the kind one, the good one. I was always just the pretty one. I thought if I could make her look smaller, I would look bigger by comparison. I didn't think it through beyond that." Kunle said nothing for a long while, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his jaw tight. "You almost married someone I don't think I actually know," he said finally, quietly, almost to himself. "The woman I met today, the woman who inherited a fortune and immediately decided to give it away to strangers, who feeds a whole street without telling anyone, who forgave every insult you threw at her without a single flicker of malice, that woman has more depth in one afternoon than I've seen from you in the 2 years we've been together." "Kunle, please," Folake said, panic finally cracking through her earlier composure. "I can change. I know I said some things I shouldn't have, but I can fix this, I promise. Just give me a chance." "I need time to think," Kunle said, and it was the last thing either of them said for the rest of the drive. Word travels fast in Lagos, faster than most people realize, and faster still when the story involves pride meeting its match in the most unexpected way. Within days, whispers of what happened in that small apartment on that quiet street began spreading, first among Morayo's neighbors who had witnessed the visit from a distance, then to mutual friends, then eventually, inevitably, back to Folake's own carefully curated circle. People began remembering things. An auntie who had once overheard Folake mocking a market woman's stretch marks in a fitting room. A former schoolmate who remembered being humiliated by Folake in front of an entire class over a stained school uniform, back when Folake herself had far less money than she pretended. A former assistant who quit after 2 months, tired of being belittled daily over small mistakes that were quickly forgiven when Folake made them herself. One by one, these stories began surfacing, not as an organized attack, but simply as people finally feeling safe enough to say out loud what they had always known privately, that behind the beautiful face and the perfect online image was a woman who built her confidence on the small humiliations of everyone around her. Folake tried to control the narrative at first. She posted cheerful photos online, business as usual, smiling captions about gratitude and blessings, hoping the noise would simply die down the way most online controversies eventually did. But this wasn't dying down. If anything, it was growing, fed by a hunger people seemed to have for stories where the arrogant finally faced consequences, where kindness finally got its due. Her wedding planning, once the center of every conversation in her life, suddenly felt distant, almost irrelevant. Kunle had gone quiet, responding to her messages with short, polite replies that carried none of the warmth from before. He had not officially called off the engagement, but the silence between them grew teeth, sharp and constant, impossible to ignore. Exactly a week after the visit, Folake found herself standing outside Morayo's door again, this time without diamonds, without designer heels, without an audience to perform for. Just her, standing awkwardly on a doorstep she once considered beneath her, working up the courage to knock. Morayo opened the door, and despite everything, despite every cruel word from the week before, her face softened immediately at the sight of her old friend standing there looking smaller than Folake had ever allowed herself to look in years. "I didn't know if you'd want to see me," Folake said quietly, her voice shaking slightly. Morayo stepped aside, silently inviting her in, the same warmth from before still somehow intact, despite everything. They sat across from each other in the same small parlor, though this time the atmosphere was entirely different. Folake stared at her hands for a long moment before finally speaking. "I've spent the last week thinking about everything I said to you, every single word. I keep replaying it, and I don't understand how you just sat there and took it. Why didn't you defend yourself? Why didn't you just tell me off?" Morayo considered the question carefully before answering. "Because I learned a long time ago that people who are cruel out of insecurity don't need a matching cruelty back. They need someone to survive their cruelty without being destroyed by it. If I had fought back that day in front of Kunle, it would have just looked like two women tearing each other apart over old wounds. I didn't want that. Not because I'm perfect, Folake, I'm far from it, but because I've buried enough people in my life to know that grudges take up space that could be used for something better. I was jealous of you," Folake admitted, the words feeling foreign and heavy, leaving her mouth for the first time in her life.
"I've been jealous of you since we were 15 years old. You were always kind, without trying, and I always had to work so hard just to be liked, and it never felt like enough. Not really, not deep down. So when I got the body and the followers and the money, I thought, finally, I had something you didn't have. And then all of this happened, and I realized you had something I never even knew existed. Something real. Morayo reached across the small space between them and took her old friend's trembling hand. You've always had something real too, Folake. You just buried it under everything you thought you needed to be seen. The girl who used to give me half her sandwich when my mother couldn't afford to pack me lunch, she's still in there somewhere. I've missed her. Tears finally broke free down Folake's carefully done face, smudging mascara she hadn't bothered to check in a mirror before coming here. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let herself cry without worrying about how it looked. I don't know if Kunle will forgive me, she whispered. That's not something I can fix for you, Morayo said gently. But I can tell you this. If he saw the woman I saw sitting here right now, the honest one, not the performance, he'd have a much easier time forgiving you than the woman who walked in here wearing diamonds and cruelty like armor. But this story would not stay simple for long, because just when it seemed like the worst had already happened, something else surfaced, something that neither Folake nor Morayo saw coming. 3 weeks after that first tearful reconciliation in Morayo's parlor, a woman named Bumi, one of Folake's oldest online followers turned personal assistant, reached out to Kunle directly. She claimed she had information he needed to hear before he made any final decisions about the wedding. Kunle, still cautious, still guarded, agreed to meet her at a quiet cafe in Lekki. What Bumi revealed shook him more than anything from that afternoon in Morayo's parlor. She told him that Folake's public apology tour, the quiet volunteering, the sudden humility, had actually started her idea, a strategy cooked up in a private meeting to salvage Folake's public image before the scandal could damage her brand deals and sponsorship contracts. Bumi showed him messages, screenshots of conversations from weeks earlier where Folake discussed damage control and image repair with the same casual calculation she once used to plan cruel jokes. Kunle sat in that cafe feeling the ground shift beneath him all over again. Had everything he witnessed over the past month, the volunteering, the tears, the quiet growth, been nothing more than an elaborate performance after all? He left the cafe without finishing his coffee, his mind spinning, unsure who to believe anymore. He drove straight to Morayo's community center, now half-built, scaffolding still standing where walls would eventually rise. He found Morayo there, sleeves rolled up, helping supervise a delivery of building materials, dust on her clothes, sweat on her brow, utterly unglamorous and completely unbothered by it. I need to ask you something, Kunle said, and told her everything Bumi had shown him. Morayo listened quietly, then let out a slow breath. I won't lie to you and tell you Folake didn't start this for the wrong reasons. Knowing her, knowing how she's always operated, I wouldn't be surprised if the first few days were about damage control. People rarely change their hearts before they change their actions. Sometimes it happens the other way around. She started doing the right thing for the wrong reason, and somewhere along the line, doing it kept changing her whether she meant it to or not. How do you know that's not just wishful thinking? Kunle asked, frustration bleeding into his voice. Because I've watched her these past 3 weeks when she didn't know I was watching, Morayo said simply. I've seen her stay behind after the cameras left, when there was no sponsorship deal to save, comforting a widow whose husband died the week before, someone she gained absolutely nothing from comforting. I've seen her give her own lunch to a child at the feeding program without posting a single photo of it. People can start a journey for selfish reasons and still end up somewhere honest. The question isn't where she started, it's where she is now and where she's still choosing to go, especially when nobody is checking. Kunle sat with that for a long moment, the dust from the construction site settling around them. I don't know if I can trust my own judgment anymore, he admitted quietly. I almost married someone I didn't fully know. Now, I don't know how to tell the difference between real change and a very good performance. Then don't rely only on judgment, Morayo said. Give it time. Real change survives scrutiny. A performance eventually cracks under pressure, especially pressure I didn't expect, like the pressure you just brought to me today without warning her first. If you're worried, don't confront her gently and give her time to prepare an answer. Surprise her. Watch what happens when she has no script ready. That evening, Kunle arrived at Folake's apartment unannounced, the very tactic Morayo suggested, and found her sitting alone on her kitchen floor, phone in hand, scrolling through old photos of her and Morayo from school days, tears streaming freely down her face, completely unaware anyone was watching. When she noticed him standing in the doorway, she didn't scramble to compose herself, didn't reach for a mirror, didn't perform surprise or grace. She simply looked up, red-eyed and unguarded, and said, "I was just thinking about how much of my life I wasted trying to be better than someone who was never trying to compete with me in the first place." Kunle told her then, plainly, what Bumi had shown him. He watched her face carefully as he spoke, searching for the flicker of a court performer scrambling to recover a script. Instead, what he saw was a woman who looked almost relieved to finally have it out in the open.
She's right, Folake admitted quietly. That's exactly how it started. I was terrified of losing my sponsorships, terrified of losing you, terrified of losing the only version of myself I knew how to be. I started volunteering because Bumi told me it would look good. I won't like you about that. But somewhere in the last few weeks, standing there feeding people who had nothing, I stopped thinking about how it looked. I started actually caring whether that old woman had eaten that day. I don't know exactly when it changed. I just know that it did. Kunle did not call off the wedding immediately, but he also did not rush back into the comfortable rhythm they once shared. Instead, he asked for something Folake had never given anyone before in her adult life: time, honesty, and proof, not through grand gestures or expensive apologies, but through small, consistent changes, only visible to someone paying close attention. Folake began volunteering quietly, without cameras, without captions, first alongside Morayo at the very community feeding program she had once mocked, then eventually at her own small initiatives that she deliberately kept off her public social media pages, understanding for the first time that some things were not meant to build an image, only to build a person. The road to earning back Kunle's trust was slow, sometimes painfully so. There were nights she cried herself to sleep, wondering if she had lost him permanently. There were moments Kunle himself questioned whether the change he was witnessing was genuine or simply another performance, more sophisticated than the last. Trust, once broken, does not rebuild itself on apologies alone. It rebuilds slowly, brick by brick, through months of consistent honesty, through choices made when no one significant was watching. Months later, the community center Morayo had dreamed of finally broke ground in Ikorodu, funded entirely by her inheritance, built exactly as she had described that afternoon. A place for widows to learn trades, for young entrepreneurs to find their footing, for children who had nowhere else to go to find safety and warmth. Folake stood among the small crowd gathered for the groundbreaking, not as the center of attention this time, but simply as a guest, watching her oldest friend cut a ribbon with hands that had built something lasting out of pain instead of hoarding it out of fear. Kunle stood beside Folake that day, his hand finding hers for the first time in months, a small gesture that carried more weight than any diamond ring ever could. He had watched her quietly, patiently for months, and slowly, carefully, he had begun to believe that the woman standing beside him now was someone worth building a life with after all. Not because she was perfect, but because she had finally learned that character mattered more than performance. The wedding eventually happened, smaller than originally planned, quieter, with far fewer influencers and far more genuine faces, including Morayo standing proudly beside Folake as her maid of honor, the very woman she had once tried to humiliate, now standing as living proof that people can change if they are brave enough to look honestly at themselves.
In the years that followed, the story of that afternoon became something of a quiet legend in that Lagos neighborhood, told and retold whenever someone needed reminded that appearances deceive far more often than they reveal, that the person you look down on today might be quietly building something that will outlast every diamond you ever wore, and that true wealth was never about what you accumulate, but about what you're willing to give away without needing anyone to see you do it. Morayo's community center still stands today, busier every year, filled with the laughter of children who had nowhere to go, the quiet determination of widows learning new trades, the ambitious energy of young entrepreneurs building their first businesses. And somewhere in that building, on a small plaque near the entrance that most visitors walk past without noticing, are the words Morayo insisted on including, words that capture everything this story was always meant to teach. Kindness is never wasted, even on those who don't deserve it, because it always finds its way back in ways you could never have imagined. If this story moved you even a little bit, if it made you think about someone in your own life, someone you judged too quickly, someone whose quiet strength you overlooked because it wasn't loud enough to notice, then do something for me right now. Hit that subscribe button because there are so many more stories like this one waiting for you. Stories about pride and humility, about hidden strength and quiet grace, about the people we underestimate until the truth finally reveals itself. Turn on your notifications too so you never miss the next one. And before you go, tell me in the comments, have you ever misjudged someone like Folake misjudged Morayo? I want to hear your story. Until next time, remember, the people who choose kindness, even when they've been wronged, are often carrying more strength than anyone around them will ever fully understand.